Welcome to my animation channel and thanks again for joining me. Today we're going to look at a scene that I did a few years ago. I called it Moonlight. It was the beginning of a series that I was working on before I got taken off to do other things such as the Painter on Safari, etc. So this animation I created 2 years ago and it's pretty dated now, but I just want to go through the process, have a look at what I'd be changing today 2 years later. That's the exterior scene. It transitions into interior scene and we see one of the main characters here, mother's calling her through the door, and then it will transition out again to have a look at the moon. So this was the beginning, the opening scene of a series that I was creating, and I'll get back to it in time, but I just got drawn off into other more pressing things like the Painter, etc. So I'm just having a relook at how I created this. As I say, this was over 2 years ago and my process has changed quite a bit, but not totally. So I just want to look at how I did things over 2 years ago and how I do them today and see what's changed, what's for the better. So the scene was initially penciled out. I must say I still like penciling out in the physical real world environment ideas. So I sketched this scene out on paper with pencil. Then I inked it with ink pens on the actual paper. I'd do that differently now. I'd ink it straight in Krita. Then I scanned it in or took a digital photo and I put it into Photoshop and colored it in Photoshop. Now I still do my coloring digitally, but I'm using Krita now. I've moved over to Krita, so that's a little different now. Then what I did back then was I broke the background into foreground and background part of this background because there's going to be a train coming through the middle. And now I would do the background separately, so I would actually plan ahead and split it up. I wouldn't draw it as one piece and then split it up afterwards. So that I'll be differently. There's a train that I created in OpenToonz in the drawing package. I'd probably do that much the same now, although I can see my perspective was slightly out. I recall battling with that because of the way it moved through the scene. The actual animation processes would pretty much be the same. And then that smoke, a lot of people have asked me about that smoke. Now when I did this, I was pretty new to OpenToonz and I did it, it's actually hard to remember how I did it, but I do remember it was a hell of a long process. I think what I did was draw all those or paint those, that soot, if you want to call it, in black and yellow. I'd paint it out and then animate batches of that paint, so I'd actually have a lot of batches of paint shooting out of those chimneys. And I recall it, out of the whole scene, that probably took the longest to do. It looks great at the end, but I would do that totally differently now. I know more about special effects in OpenToonz and I'd use pars and all sorts of things that I didn't have any idea how to do 2 years ago. So that I do differently. Whether it be better or not than that, I have no idea, but I definitely do it differently. And then what I did is I came back a little later and re-looked at how I wanted to create these backgrounds. Reason being that the actual ink work that I'd done had been on paper and I wouldn't be doing that now. I'd be inking it in Krita, but I'd actually done the black ink work on paper, and when I'd scanned it in or brought it in, it looked pretty messy because of scale and everything. So I wanted to look at a different way of doing the backgrounds and especially the buildings because there's a lot of straight lines. So I wanted to work out a way to do these buildings a little bit more architecturally correct, if you want to call it. So that's what this is about. I made a separate video about this quite a while back. I used a vector drawing package to do this. You can use Illustrator. I use CorelDRAW more than I use Illustrator. And I drew this building out using the vectors, so it was nice and clean. And then my intention was to pull that into Photoshop and rough it up and give it textures, etc., etc. Although today I'd use Krita. I never got as far as that, but that was the intention. So draw it in a vector package to get those nice clean lines. I like using a vector package to draw nice straight lines, solid objects, because I'm very fast at it, and you can start with a nice crisp object, if you want to call it that, and work from there. So I like working that way. I still like working that way. And then to make it more real world and grungy, and to try and blend it in with a more painted background or painted scene, bring it into something like Photoshop or Krita, etc. So definitely I'm using Krita. I'm not using Photoshop these days, but I'd probably do this process all over again. So it's quite interesting a couple of years later to have a look back and see how it's working then and how it's different now. There are things that I still do the same, like I do like sketching stuff out with a pencil and on paper. I'd do all the inking in Krita, and I'd probably use a drawing package like CorelDRAW Illustrator to do a lot of the line work. And then the painting, etc., all the rendering I'd do in Krita. You may use Photoshop, but I do all that the same. The stuff like the smoke, etc., I'd do that totally differently using special effects more. And there's other stuff in the scene that I'd do totally differently, like all that lighting in the buildings or whatever. I'd do that totally differently. I'd actually have cutouts, and I'd have lights set behind those windows to give it a more realistic effect. So there's quite a bit that I'd probably do differently and do a lot better, which is good because you want to get better. This was over 2 years ago, and I'll probably get back to this in only another couple of years when I finish the Safari movie. So hopefully by the time I get back to it, I'll totally redo the scene, as it is an anchoring scene to the series. Anyway, I just wanted to go through this with you and just show you what I used to do and what I do a little differently or would do differently now. Hopefully you do this with your work process as well. You will be changing as you go. Everything hopefully gets better, or you use different tools that you didn't use before. Thanks very much for joining my animation channel. If you haven't already, please go ahead and subscribe. And if you'd like to join the mailing list, go ahead and do that. And thanks again. I'll see you again soon. All the best. Bye.